Hashtag the vanishing at Dead Man's Creek. Hashtag a documentary by Verital Files. The body was found on a Tuesday. Or rather, part of a body, the head and left arm of a man, stripped to the bone by scavengers, discovered beneath a limestone overhang 2 miles south of the old military road. A trapper named Jeremiah Watts made the find in the autumn of 1887 while setting beaver traps along the creek that the Osage called the place where the dead man lies. The sheriff from Fort Smith, Arkansas, rode out to investigate. He took one look at the scene, turned his horse around, and never spoke publicly about what he saw. The first newspaper to report the discovery was the Fort Smith Elevator on October 28, 1887. It ran a single paragraph on page 3. A decomposed body, believed to be that of a white male, was discovered near the old Indian Territory line. The remains were partially consumed by animals. No identification was possible. The coroner's inquest returned a verdict of death by unknown means. The matter is closed. The matter was not closed. It was just beginning. What Jeremiah Watts found that morning wasn't a simple tragedy, a traveler killed by outlaws or a man fallen from his horse. What he found was the end of a trail that led backward through more than a decade of silence, into the heart of a crime that powerful men had spent years trying to bury. And at the center of that crime was a document that should never have existed, a law that should never have been written, and a child who disappeared into the fog of history and never came back. In November 1887, a schoolteacher named Margaret Crowley arrived in the small settlement of Choctaw in the Indian Territory. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and had accepted a position teaching at a one-room schoolhouse established by the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Missions. The school served a scattered community of mixed-blood Choctaw and white settlers who had carved out farms along the Arkansas border. Margaret came from a family of teachers. Her father had been a professor of classical languages at the University of Tennessee until the war, when he'd fled to Arkansas to escape the chaos. He died of typhoid in 1873, leaving Margaret and her mother to make their way in a world that had little patience for educated women. When her mother passed in 1885, Margaret packed what she could carry and moved west. "I want to be useful," she wrote in her diary on the eve of her journey. "There are children out there who need to learn, and I have no other purpose left." Choctaw was not what she expected. The settlement was little more than a general store, a post office, a church that also served as a meeting hall, and a cluster of cabins scattered along the creek. The Choctaw families who had been here before the white settlers arrived spoke a mix of English and their own language. The white families were mostly farmers struggling to make a living on land that the government had promised to the tribes. But there was something else in Choctaw. Something that the settlers didn't talk about, something that the Choctaw elders mentioned only in whispers. Something that had to do with a creek called Dead Man's, and a discovery that had been made there just weeks before Margaret arrived. The schoolhouse stood on a hill above the creek, a single room of rough-hewn logs with a stone fireplace and a blackboard that Margaret had to scrub clean every morning. There were 19 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 16. Most had never written their names until Margaret showed them how to hold a piece of chalk. She kept a careful record of her students in a ledger she'd brought from home. The names told the story of the land: Abigail and Ezekiel Parnell, whose father ran the general store; Joseph and Martha Teller, whose mother was Choctaw and whose father had come from Georgia; James and William Cargill, sons of a farmer whose wife had died the previous winter. And then there were the children with no surnames recorded, orphans, or children from families so poor they didn't think they needed a family name. The ledger entry for November 1887 listed 19 students. The entry for December showed 18. One child had vanished. The first one to disappear was a boy named Eli, 6 years old, the son of a Choctaw woman named Susanna and a white man who died in a logging accident 2 years before. Eli was a quiet child, always arriving at school an hour early and sitting on the steps watching the sunlight move across the floor. On the morning of December 7, 1887, Eli didn't come to school. Margaret assumed he was sick. There was a chill that winter, and many families struggled to keep their children warm. She asked his mother when she saw her at the general store the next day. Susanna's face went white. "He didn't come home," she said. "He left for school in the morning." I thought he was here." The search began within the hour. Neighbors fanned out across the countryside, calling Eli's name through the hollows and along the frozen creek. They found nothing. After 3 days, a man named Hiram Burtis found a small boot near Dead Man's Creek, the same creek where the body had been discovered the previous autumn. The boot was exactly the right size for a 6-year-old boy. Sheriff Elisha Hammer of Fort Smith came to investigate. Hammer was a man who knew the Indian Territory better than most lawmen. He'd been a deputy U.S. Marshal before taking the sheriff's office, and he'd seen more than his share of disappearances. Most were the work of outlaws or whiskey traders. Some were the result of old feuds that had never been resolved. But something about this case bothered him. "People don't just vanish from a schoolhouse path," he said to Margaret when he interviewed her. "Especially not children. Someone saw something." Margaret had seen something too, a man, on the morning Eli disappeared, standing at the edge of the woods near the creek. She'd assumed he was a hunter, or maybe one of the men who worked the timber camps upriver. She'd only seen him for a moment, and she hadn't thought to report it. Now she wished she had. She described the man as tall, with dark hair and a heavy beard, wearing a long coat that had seen better days. He was white, or at least light-skinned enough to pass for it. There was nothing unusual about him, he looked like every other trapper or logger who passed through the settlement. But Hammer noticed something. When Margaret described the man's coat, she mentioned that it had a single brass button missing from the lower row. The sheriff made a note in his journal. "That's a small detail," he said. "But sometimes small details are all we have." The story of the dead man at the creek had already begun to fade when Eli disappeared. The coroner's inquest had been a formality. No one knew who the man was, how he died, or why his body had been left under a limestone overhang. The only clue had been a piece of paper found in the remains of a pocket, too badly decayed to read. But the inquest record, stored in the Fort Smith courthouse, contained one detail that the newspapers never printed. The dead man had not been killed by animals. He'd been killed by something else, a blow to the back of the head that had shattered the skull. And the weapon that had done it, found near the body, was a length of iron pipe. Someone had murdered the man and left him where the scavengers would do their work. And whoever did it had made sure the body wouldn't be found by coming back and covering it with rocks. That detail was known to only a few people: the sheriff, the coroner, and the deputy who'd helped with the investigation. Now, with Eli missing, that detail seemed to matter. January 1888 brought a hard freeze. Dead Man's Creek became impassable, and the search for Eli ground to a halt. His mother, Susanna, refused to believe that her son had died. She walked the frozen creekside every day, calling his name until her voice gave out. Margaret wrote in her diary, "I cannot imagine the pain of a mother who does not know where her child lies. The cold seems to have entered my soul." Then, in February, something happened that changed everything. A settler named Calvin Hodge was clearing brush along the upper reaches of Dead Man's Creek when he found something half buried in a streambed, a leather satchel, waterlogged but intact, containing a collection of papers that had been carefully wrapped in oilcloth. The papers were addressed to a man named Thomas P. Jennings, a surveyor who had worked in the Indian Territory during the 1870s. They were letters, dozens of them, written between 1874 and 1886. Some were personal, addressed to Jennings by his wife and children. Others were official, sent by the U.S. Department of the Interior regarding land claims. But there was one document that caught Calvin Hodge's attention. It was a letter from a man named Elias B. a government agent who'd been assigned to the Indian Territory to investigate claims of fraud involving the Choctaw and Cherokee land allotments. The letter was dated February 12, 1878. And it mentioned a child. Elias B. was a federal investigator with an unusual assignment. In the decade after the Civil War, the Indian Territory had become a magnet for every kind of corruption imaginable. Land speculators, whiskey traders, and men who called themselves attorneys made fortunes by cheating the tribes out of their property. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was too understaffed to police the territory effectively, and the federal marshals who were supposed to be protecting tribal interests were often more interested in collecting bounties. Winter was different. He was a man who believed in the law, and he'd been sent into the territory specifically to document the frauds that were being committed against the Choctaw and Cherokee nations. The letter found in the satchel was part of that investigation. Winter wrote to Jennings, who'd been assisting him, asking for information about a family named Parnell, the same Parnells who owned the general store in Keota. James Parnell is involved, Winter wrote. He is not the only one. There is a network of men who have been stealing children from the Choctaw and trading them to families in Arkansas. They call it adoption, but it is nothing but slavery in another form. I have found a legal document, signed by a judge in Van Buren, that purports to give custody of a Choctaw child to a white family. The child's mother is still alive. She never signed anything. The law has been twisted to serve greed, and the children are the ones who pay. The letter went on to describe a system of fraud that had been operating for years. Choctaw families, impoverished by war and disease, would be approached by men who offered to help them. They would be told that their children would be given a better life in Arkansas schooling, a proper home, a chance to become civilized. In exchange, the families would receive money, or food, or sometimes just the promise that they wouldn't be evicted from their land. But the promises were lies. The children weren't being adopted. They were being taken to work on farms, in mines, in households where they would never be allowed to leave. And the documents that made it all legal were forged or obtained through bribery. The courts are complicit, Winter wrote. The judge who signed the document I found was paid $100 for his signature. He will never be prosecuted, because the men who paid him are the same men who own the banks and the newspapers. I am assembling evidence. I am going to expose them all. The letter was never sent. Thomas P. Jennings died of a fever in 1880. His papers, including Winter's letter, were stored in the satchel and forgotten. But the letter's mention of James Parnell made Calvin Hodge think about the Parnells in Keota. He took the satchel to the sheriff. Sheriff Hammer read Elias Winter's letter carefully. He read it 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time. The letter mentioned a judge in Van Buren, Arkansas, a man named Levi T. Grimes. Grimes had been removed from the bench in 1882 for irregularities in his conduct, but by then he'd already signed dozens of custody orders involving Choctaw children. The records of those orders had been destroyed in a fire at the Van Buren courthouse in 1883. Or so everyone believed. Hammer sent a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Smith. The Marshal's response was terse: investigate, but be careful. There are men involved in this who are not to be trifled with. Hammer knew that phrase well. It meant that he was walking into something larger than a missing child. The investigation that followed uncovered something that would have shocked the citizens of the Indian Territory if they had ever been told the truth. James Parnell wasn't just a merchant. He was a prominent figure in the local Democratic Party, a man who'd been appointed to several minor offices by the territorial government. He was also, according to the documents Hammer found, a member of a ring that had been trafficking Choctaw children for more than a decade. The ring's operations were simple. Men would approach Choctaw families in remote areas of the territory, offering to help them with their legal troubles. They'd promise to find homes for their children, homes where they would be educated and cared for. They'd present papers that looked official, signed by judges and bureaucrats. The families were told that their children would be returned when they were grown. They'd be allowed to visit. It was all perfectly legal. It was not legal. The papers were forged. The judges had been bribed. The families never saw their children again. And sometimes, when the children were no longer useful, when they got sick, or refused to work, or became too old to control, the ring would find other ways to dispose of them. Eli wasn't the first child to disappear from Keota. But he was the first one whose disappearance had been noticed by someone who cared enough to ask questions. Hammer's investigation led him to a farm on the Arkansas side of the border, owned by a man named Cyrus G. Webb. Webb had a reputation as a hard worker, someone who could get things done, no questions asked. He'd made his fortune during the war, supplying beef to the Confederate Army, and after the war he'd diversified into timber and mining. His operation was large enough that he could afford to keep his workers in isolation. They lived in cabins on his property, never leaving except for supervised trips to the general store for supplies. The children who worked for Webb were largely invisible to the outside world. When Hammer arrived at Webb's farm with a deputy and a federal marshal, he found 12 children living in a shed that had been converted into a bunkhouse. They ranged in age from 5 to 14. Some were obviously Choctaw. Others looked white, probably the children of poor families from Arkansas who'd been told their children would be given an education. All of them were working 18-hour days in Webb's timber operation. None of them had seen a schoolroom. None of them had been paid. And none of them were registered on any official document. Hammer arrested Webb and his foreman. The children were taken to a temporary shelter in Fort Smith, where they were photographed and their testimonies were recorded. The photographs were sent to the Indian agencies, and a handful of the children were identified. But most were never claimed. Their families, if they still existed, were scattered across the territory, living in poverty and unable to travel to Fort Smith. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Van Buren declined to prosecute. The case against Webb was dismissed on a technicality. The children had been voluntarily surrendered by their parents, according to documents that had been produced by James Parnell's law office. The documents were, of course, forgeries. But proving that would have required taking testimony from the families themselves, and the government had no interest in spending the money. Webb was released. He returned to his farm and continued his operations, though he made sure that the children he employed were not visible to anyone who might ask questions. James Parnell was never charged. The story of the Dead Man's Creek murder came back to life in the summer of 1888. A man named Owen McFeeters, a fugitive from a robbery charge in Texas, was arrested near Fort Smith. When he was searched, he was carrying a pocket watch that had been reported stolen from a man named Cyrus Webb, the same Cyrus Webb who'd been arrested and then released. McFeeters had been working as a hand on Webb's farm when he'd stolen the watch and fled. He told the investigators that he'd seen the body of a man in the shed where the children were kept, covered with a tarp. The boss was real nervous, McFeeters said. He kept saying we had to get rid of it. So he and his men loaded it onto a wagon and took it somewhere. I didn't ask where. The description McFeeters gave of the body matched the one found at Dead Man's Creek. A tall, white male, dark hair, heavy beard. He hadn't seen the man's face, it had been covered by the tarp. But he'd heard Webb and his men talking about the body. This is what happens to people who get too curious, Webb had said. McFeeters identified Webb as the man who'd been involved in the murder. He also identified James Parnell as a frequent visitor to Webb's farm. Parnell had been there the day the body was discovered in the shed. Webb denied everything. His lawyer produced documents showing that McFeeters was a convicted felon and a liar. The district attorney declined to press charges, citing insufficient evidence. But the case was reopened, and Hammer began asking questions about the man who might have been the victim. There were rumors that a federal investigator named Elias had disappeared in 1886, after threatening to expose a child trafficking ring. Winter had vanished so completely that no one knew if he was alive or dead. He'd been working in the Indian Territory, investigating fraud and corruption. Then, suddenly, he was gone. Some said he'd been killed. Some said he'd gone to another part of the country, using a different name. A few claimed they'd seen him in Kansas, working as a clerk in a dry goods store. Hammer thought he knew the truth. But the truth was something he could never prove. In the winter of 1888, Margaret Crowley made a discovery that would change everything. She was clearing out the schoolhouse's storage room when she found a box that had been pushed into a corner and forgotten. Inside the box was a collection of old papers, some dating back to the 1870s, when the schoolhouse had been built. They were mostly receipts for supplies, but there were also a few letters. One of the letters was addressed to the schoolhouse itself, Kyoto School, Indian Territory. It was from a man who identified himself as an attorney for the Choctaw Nation. The letter, dated February 10, 1886, was written to the school's administrator, a man named Josiah Mills, who died in 1885. The letter was short and direct. The practice of removing children from their tribes for education without consent of the tribal government is illegal. I have been instructed to demand the return of all Choctaw children who were taken to the school for this purpose. Please provide a list of the children who have been enrolled. Margaret read the letter and felt the hair on her arms rise. She'd been teaching for a year at the school. She knew that at least 3 of the children on her current roster were Choctaw. But she also knew that they had been abandoned by their families. That's what the administrators had told her when she'd started. The children, 2 boys and a girl, were orphans. Their parents were dead, or had moved away. The school had taken them in as charity cases. But now she wasn't sure. She went through the school's records, which were stored in another box. The records were incomplete, some pages were missing, and some were so faded they couldn't be read. But she was able to piece together a list of students who'd been enrolled in the 1870s. Of the 38 names, 19 were listed as Choctaw or mixed. Most of those had been placed in the school by the same man, James Parnell. Parnell had signed the papers. He'd vouched for the families. He'd approved the transfers from the Choctaw agencies. And the children had disappeared from the school's records without explanation. Margaret took her findings to Sheriff Hammer. The sheriff listened carefully, then sighed. "I've known about Parnell for a long time," he said. "He's too powerful to touch. He's got money, and he's got friends in the government." The attorney who wrote that letter, the one from the Choctaw Nation, he died in 1886. He was found dead in his office in Muskogee. They said it was a heart attack. "You don't think it was?" Margaret asked. "I think a lot of people have died in the Indian Territory who shouldn't have died," Hammer said. "I think there's a pattern. But I can't prove anything." The sheriff paused, then added, "I think the man who was found at Dead Man's Creek was someone who got too close to the truth. And I think whoever killed him will kill again if they're threatened." In December 1888, a year after Eli's disappearance, Sheriff Hammer received a letter from the U.S. Department of the Interior. The letter was signed by an official named Matthew or Van Buren, chief of the Indian Division. The letter instructed Hammer to cease all investigations into the child trafficking ring. It claimed that the matter was already under federal investigation and that local law enforcement had overstepped its authority. Hammer ignored the letter. He had seen too much, and he had come to care too deeply about the children who'd been stolen. He knew that the federal investigation was a fiction, a way for the Department of the Interior to protect the men who'd been profiting from the trafficking. He continued investigating. In February 1889, Sheriff Hammer's house burned to the ground. The fire started in the basement, where he kept his files. Most of the documents he collected, the photographs, the testimony, the letter from Elias Winter, were destroyed. Hammer barely escaped with his life. His wife and children were staying with relatives at the time of the fire, and he was alone. The county official who investigated the fire ruled it an accident. No one believed that. Hammer knew that the fire was a warning. He packed his remaining belongings and moved to Fort Smith, where he took a job as a private investigator. He never talked about the Dead Man's Creek case again. But the fire didn't destroy everything. The contents of Elias Winter's satchel, the letters found by Calvin Hodge, had been stored in a bank vault in Fort Smith, not in Hammer's house. They survived. And among those letters was one that Hammer had never shown to anyone. It was a letter from Winter to a man named Henry K. Hale, a surveyor who'd worked with him in the Indian Territory. In the letter, Winter described something that, if true, would rewrite the history of the Indian Territory. He claimed that the child trafficking ring wasn't just a local operation. It was part of a larger conspiracy, involving some of the most powerful men in the territory, men who'd been appointed to their positions by the U.S. government. The ring, Winter wrote, had been created in the 1870s to serve 2 purposes. First, it provided labor for the timber and mining operations that were expanding across the territory. Second, it served as a way to thin out the Native American population, making it easier to take their land. The men who ran the ring had a name for themselves: the Friends of the Territory. They met in the back rooms of hotels and bars, and they discussed their plans in language that sounded almost patriotic. Winter had managed to infiltrate the group for a few months, posing as a land speculator. He'd compiled a list of names, dozens of names, including judges, politicians, and business leaders. And then he'd written the letter to Hale, promising to send the list if anything happened to him. The letter was dated April 6, 1886. Winter was never seen again. The list never surfaced. Hale died in 1887 of a heart attack at age 41. He'd been in good health, according to his physician. The list, if it had existed, was lost with him. But Winter's letter remains a piece of evidence that points to something larger than any single murder. The child trafficking ring was part of a pattern of corruption and violence that shaped the Indian Territory for decades. And the men who ran it were never brought to justice. The fire in Hammer's house destroyed most of his files. But a few pieces of evidence survived. One of them, a photograph that had been given to Hammer by a woman who'd been one of the trafficked children, was found intact. The photo showed a group of children standing outside a schoolhouse, not the Kyoto school, but a larger building in Arkansas. The children were labeled with numbers, not names. The photo was dated 1885, just before Winter disappeared. It was the last piece of evidence in a case that was never solved. What happened to Elias Winter? No one knows. His body was never found, and his name appears in no official records after 1886. Some say he fled the territory and started a new life. Others say he was murdered, his body thrown into the Arkansas River. What happened to Eli, the 6-year-old boy who vanished on the path to school? He was never found. His mother spent the rest of her life searching for him, and when she died in 1912, her last words were his name. The child trafficking ring continued to operate for years, despite the investigation. But the men who ran it became more careful. They made sure that the children they took were never registered, never photographed, never seen by anyone who might ask questions. The evidence that Elias Winter had gathered was destroyed. The list of names was lost. And the dead man at Dead Man's Creek was forgotten. In the end, the question remains, who was the man found at Dead Man's Creek? Was he a traveler, killed by outlaws? Was he the investigator Elias Winter, who'd gotten too close to the truth? Or was he someone else entirely, a victim of the same system that had stolen so many children from their families? The coroner's report, still stored in the Fort Smith courthouse, gives no answers. The body was buried in an unmarked grave near the creek, and its location has been lost to time. All that remains is the letter from Elias Winter, and the memory of a boy who went to school one morning and never came home. And the silence of the Dead Man's Creek, flowing through the land where so many children vanished without a trace. #afterword. The story of Dead Man's Creek is not an isolated tragedy. It is part of a larger pattern of violence and exploitation that shaped the American frontier, a pattern that is often hidden in the archives, forgotten by official histories. In the decades after the Civil War, the Indian Territory became a place where the law was a fiction, and where men who had money and power could do whatever they wanted. The child trafficking ring that operated in the 1880s was not the only one of its kind. Similar operations existed in other parts of the country, run by men who saw the tribes as obstacles to be removed and their children as resources to be exploited. The question is, how many other stories like this have been forgotten? How many other children vanished without a trace, their names erased from the records? How many other investigators died, their work unfinished, their evidence destroyed? The men who ran the ring were never brought to justice. They lived long lives, died in comfortable homes, and are remembered in local histories as pioneers and community builders. The children they trafficked are remembered by no one, except perhaps in the stories of their descendants. And the dead man at Dead Man's Creek remains unknown, his identity buried with his bones. We cannot bring him back. We cannot undo the harm that was done. But we can remember. We can tell the story so that it is not lost. And we can ask the question that still haunts the banks of that forgotten creek. What happened to the children? And who is still trying to hide the answer? ****. The answer may be buried deeper than we can ever dig. But as long as we keep asking the question, the dead man at Dead Man's Creek will not be forgotten.